Ladies and gentlemen, in a world where narcissistic control often thrives on silence, self-doubt, and emotional manipulation, the empath has long been cast as the vulnerable one, the one who feels too much, gives too much, and breaks too quietly. But what happens when the empath stops shrinking and starts rising? When they transform their pain into purpose, their boundaries into power, and their voice into something no longer afraid to be heard. In the spirit of Brené Brown's work on vulnerability, courage, and shame resilience, this exploration dives into what happens when the empath no longer plays the role they were assigned. This is not about revenge through harm, it's about redemption through healing. The empath's revenge isn't loud, it's grounded, powerful, and rooted in the radical act of reclaiming one's worth. Vulnerability is often misunderstood, especially by those who fear it. For narcissists, vulnerability is seen as a flaw, a weakness to exploit, a doorway into someone's emotional world that can be used for manipulation and control. But for the empath, vulnerability has always been part of their nature. They feel deeply, connect intuitively, and sense the unspoken emotions of those around them. In the beginning, this sensitivity is often used against them. The narcissist targets the empath precisely because of this openness, knowing that the empath will try to understand, forgive, and extend compassion even when they are being hurt. The empath absorbs blame, rationalizes emotional abuse, and continues to believe in the potential of the narcissist even as they are slowly losing themselves. Vulnerability in this context feels like a curse. But that's only part of the story. It is the choice to show up and be seen when we have no control over the outcome. For the empath, the transformation begins the moment they stop viewing their sensitivity as a flaw and start seeing it as their most powerful asset. The real revenge against narcissistic control isn't retaliation, it's revelation. It's the moment the empath sees that their ability to feel deeply, to care, and to stand in truth is not something to be ashamed of. It's their superpower. And once they embrace this truth, the entire dynamic shifts. Narcissists feed off control. They create chaos to keep others off balance. They use gaslighting to cause the empath to question their reality. They manipulate through guilt, shame, and fear, but all of these tactics rely on one key assumption, that the empath believes they are weak. The moment that belief changes, the power the narcissist holds begins to dissolve. Vulnerability, when embraced, turns into strength. It says, I am willing to be seen as I am. I will no longer perform for your approval or beg for your validation. That kind of honesty is terrifying to someone who lives behind a mask. Reclaiming vulnerability is a deeply courageous act. It means owning their story, not just the parts that feel good, but the pain, the confusion, the moments of silence when they should have spoken up, the years spent trying to earn love that should have been freely given. It's a confrontation with the self, one that is raw and often painful. But it is also liberating. It frees the empath from the toxic dance of proving their worth to someone who is never capable of seeing it. Vulnerability says, I can hurt and still be whole. I can fall apart and still be strong. I can feel everything and still move forward. This internal shift becomes visible in how the empath starts to live. They stop apologizing for being too emotional. They stop explaining themselves to people who have no interest in understanding. They stop over-functioning in relationships that are emotionally one-sided. Instead, they begin to speak with clarity. They say no without guilt. They prioritize self-care without shame. They ask for what they need without fearing abandonment. And most importantly, they stop trying to fix broken people at the cost of breaking themselves. Once thrived on the empath's silence and self-doubt is now met with boundaries, truth, and a quiet kind of defiance. It's not loud or aggressive. It doesn't need to be. The empath doesn't need to destroy the narcissist to win. They just need to stop playing the game. Vulnerability has taught them that strength isn't in armor, it's in honesty. It's in the willingness to feel, to risk, to show up fully, even when there are no guarantees. The empath begins to attract different kinds of relationships, ones built on mutual respect, reciprocity, and emotional safety. They are no longer drawn to chaos or confusion. They are no longer seduced by charm that hides cruelty. Instead, they seek connection that honors who they are. And because they've done the hard work of sitting with their pain, understanding their patterns, and rewriting their narrative, they are no longer afraid of being alone. They are not desperate for approval. They are not looking to be rescued. They have rescued themselves. That is exactly what the empath does when they choose healing over revenge, truth over silence, self-worth over self-sacrifice. They are not seeking to hurt the narcissist, they are simply refusing to be hurt anymore. And that shift, that reclaiming of emotional truth, is more powerful than any revenge they could ever imagine. Empaths often grow up believing that love is something they must earn through sacrifice, silence, or self-erasure. They become experts at reading moods, anticipating needs, and adjusting themselves to maintain harmony. This tendency, though rooted in compassion, often leads them to overextend emotionally, especially in relationships with narcissists. Narcissists are drawn to empaths not only because of their emotional openness, but also because of their blurred or non-existent boundaries. The empath becomes the perfect supply, always giving, always forgiving, always staying. But what the narcissist never expects is that one day the empath will learn to say no. And when that day comes, everything changes. Boundaries are often misunderstood, especially by people pleasers. They are mistaken for walls, harsh, cold, rigid barriers that push others away. But in reality, boundaries are more like doors. They define what we allow in and what we keep out. They're not about control. They are about clarity. For the empath, learning to set boundaries is not a betrayal of their nature. It is, in fact, the ultimate act of self-respect. The process is uncomfortable at first. Saying no feels selfish. Walking away feels wrong. Standing firm feels like conflict. But with each boundary drawn, the empath begins to reclaim space in their own life. The narcissist depends on the empath's inability to say no. They rely on the empath's over-functioning, on their need to fix, to smooth over, to take responsibility for everything. But boundaries dismantle that dependency. They draw a line in the sand. They say, "This is not mine to carry." And for a narcissist who thrives on control, that is destabilizing. The dynamic that once felt so safe, the emotional seesaw where the empath was always down and the narcissist always up, suddenly becomes balanced. And with balance comes loss of control. The empath learns to hold boundaries. They stop leaking energy. They stop explaining themselves to people who are committed to misunderstanding them. They stop negotiating with manipulation. Instead, they begin to evaluate each relationship, not through guilt or obligation, but through the lens of respect and reciprocity. They ask, does this connection nourish me, or does it drain me? And when the answer is the latter, they walk away, not with anger, but with certainty. That might seem contradictory at first, especially for empaths who believe that saying yes to everyone is the definition of kindness. But real compassion requires clarity. It requires knowing what is and isn't okay. Without boundaries, kindness turns into martyrdom. Without boundaries, love becomes performance. The empath who has no boundaries slowly disappears under the weight of everyone else's expectations. But with boundaries, they begin to come back to themselves. There is a profound shift when the empath stops viewing boundaries as rejection and starts seeing them as protection. They are not protecting themselves from love. They are protecting love from being tainted by resentment. Because when we give too much, for too long, without receiving anything in return, our giving becomes contaminated. It becomes a silent plea for recognition. It becomes a quiet scream for reciprocity. And when that reciprocity never comes, we burn out, grow bitter, or collapse. Boundaries prevent that collapse. They allow the empath to keep their heart open without letting it be trampled. The narcissist doesn't respond well to boundaries. They challenge them. They mock them. They accuse the empath of being cold, distant, or selfish. They push every button they installed in the empath to make them feel guilty. But once the empath has tasted the peace that comes from self-honoring, they become immune to those tactics. They see the manipulation for what it is. They understand that love isn't supposed to cost them their sanity, their sleep, or their self-worth. This is the quiet revenge, the kind that doesn't seek to hurt, but simply refuses to be hurt again. The empath no longer engages in an emotional tug-of-war. They don't justify their boundaries or argue with someone who pretends not to understand them. They just disengage. They detach. They choose peace over drama. And that choice speaks louder than any confrontation ever could. There is power in walking away without slamming the door. There is strength in silence when it comes from clarity, not fear. The empath learns that boundaries are not about controlling others. They're about choosing themselves. And choosing yourself after years of being chosen last is revolutionary. The narcissist may try to return, to reestablish control, to test the boundaries, but the empath is no longer in the same place. They are no longer available for manipulation. They are no longer accessible to chaos. They have redefined what they allow in their life, and that redefinition changes everything. Daring to set boundaries is about having the courage to love ourselves even when we risk disappointing others. And that is exactly what the empath does when they say, I will not carry what is not mine. I will not abandon myself to keep someone else comfortable. This courage, quiet and firm, becomes the foundation of their strength. And that strength, rooted in clarity and self-trust, becomes the most profound response to any form of control. Shame is one of the most potent tools in a narcissist's arsenal. It is subtle, insidious, and deeply disorienting. For empaths who are often guided by a strong internal compass of morality and emotional responsibility, shame lands quickly and cuts deeply. Narcissists instinctively understand this. They know how to exploit the empath's sensitivity, how to twist their emotions until they believe they are always the problem. You're too sensitive. You're overreacting. You're imagining things. These phrases become familiar refrains in the empath's world. Slowly, the empath internalizes the idea that their emotions are wrong, their perceptions are flawed, and their reactions are exaggerated. This is not just manipulation. It is a systemic dismantling of the empath's self-trust. Shame convinces them they are broken, and from that place, control becomes effortless. There is a moment, a quiet reckoning, when the empath begins to name what has been happening. It often comes not in the middle of a dramatic confrontation, but in silence when they are alone, away from the noise and confusion, reflecting on the consistent patterns of blame and invalidation. This moment of clarity is the beginning of something powerful, because the antidote to shame is truth. And truth, once spoken, begins to loosen the grip of everything that once held them captive. Brené Brown teaches that shame thrives in secrecy, silence, and judgment. But when we talk about it, when we bring it into the light, it begins to wither. The empath begins to realize, I am not too much. I was just made to feel like I was. This realization does not come all at once. It is a slow and sometimes painful unfolding. The empath may revisit memories they once explained away, moments they blamed themselves for, words that haunted them long after they were spoken. But with each act of reflection, with each attempt to understand rather than excuse, the narrative begins to change. The empath stops asking, what's wrong with me? And starts asking, why did I accept being treated this way? That shift is monumental. It marks the beginning of a new story, one not rooted in shame, but in self-awareness. Speaking the truth about their experience becomes an act of liberation. Whether through therapy, journaling, conversations with trusted friends, or simply admitting it to themselves, the empath begins to unravel the shame narrative. They stop protecting the image of the narcissist and start protecting themselves. They begin to understand that the person who made them feel broken was often projecting their own brokenness. That realization does not excuse the behavior, but it explains it, and it separates the empath's identity from the shame they were made to carry. The empath turns their compassion inward. When they start offering themselves the same kindness they offer others, healing accelerates. They learn to say things like, I did the best I could with what I knew at the time, or I'm not perfect, but I didn't deserve to be shamed for being human. These aren't just affirmations. They are truths that directly confront the lies they were fed. The more they say them, the more they believe them. And the more they believe them, the less power the narcissist's voice has in their head. Not just from others, but from themselves. They stop pretending that everything is okay when it's not. They stop minimizing their hurt. They stop dressing up their pain as patience. They let themselves be honest about how much it hurt and how long they stayed silent. And in doing so, they move from shame to resilience. They don't need to be perfect to be worthy. They don't need to be invulnerable to be strong. They simply need to be honest. Honesty becomes their armor, not shame. The narcissist no longer has access to the same emotional levers. Where once they could trigger doubt and guilt with a single phrase, they now encounter silence, clarity, and most powerfully, non-engagement. The empath no longer reacts from shame. They respond from truth. And that shift is disarming. It leaves the narcissist confused, powerless, and exposed. The empath does not need to shout or prove anything. Their presence, grounded and unapologetic, is enough. Shame loses its grip when it is no longer a secret. And the empath, who once felt like a prisoner to others' perceptions, now moves through life with quiet confidence. This confidence doesn't mean the pain never happened. It means the pain no longer defines them. They have transmuted it. Where there was once self-doubt, there is now discernment. Where there was once confusion, there is now clarity. Where there was once shame, there is now self-respect. They speak their truth, not for revenge, but for release. They don't need others to validate it. They validate themselves. This is the empath's real revenge, not to harm the narcissist, but to heal so deeply that the narcissist's influence becomes irrelevant. The empath no longer needs to win or prove or retaliate.
They have found something far more powerful than vindication. They have found peace. There comes a moment in the life of an empath when exhaustion outweighs hope. After endless cycles of giving, explaining, forgiving, and trying to be enough for someone who keeps moving the goalposts, the empath finally reaches the edge. It doesn't look dramatic from the outside. There's no shouting, no slammed doors. But internally, something irreversible shifts. They stop trying to make the narcissist see their pain. They stop hoping that one more compromise, one more calm conversation, or one more sacrifice will change the dynamic. Instead, they begin to wonder what it might look like to choose themselves. That question, small and quiet at first, becomes the spark for a profound transformation. It's not driven by anger or resentment. It's driven by a desire for peace, for truth, and for a life no longer dominated by emotional survival. This is courage, the empath's decision to stop waiting for the narcissist to change and to start reclaiming their own life. Courage for the empath doesn't look like what most people imagine. It isn't loud or flashy. It doesn't involve revenge or confrontation. Instead, it begins in the silent choices, not replying to the baiting message, declining the invitation that feels manipulative, ending the conversation that always ends in blame. These small acts of defiance are actually acts of deep self-love. They require the empath to risk disappointment, to risk being misunderstood, and most frighteningly, to risk being alone. For someone who has been conditioned to tie their worth to being needed, this is no small task. But once the empath begins to taste what peace feels like, what it feels like to no longer be in emotional chaos, they cannot unknow it. The narcissist's control often thrives on the empath's fear of abandonment. They create dependency, sometimes subtly, sometimes overtly. They make the empath believe that love must be earned, that stability is conditional, and that they alone hold the power to give or take approval. But the empath's courage is in realizing that peace does not come from the narcissist's approval, it comes from inner alignment. This realization is what begins to dismantle the power dynamic. The empath starts to ask new questions. What do I want? What feels good to me? What am I tolerating that I no longer need to? These questions are dangerous to narcissistic control because they mark the beginning of self-ownership. This shift is uncomfortable. The empath will feel guilt. They will question whether they are being unkind. They will grieve the fantasy of who they hope the narcissist could become. But they will also begin to breathe again. They will feel moments of calm they haven't felt in years. They will begin to recognize that their nervous system has been in a constant state of alert, that they have been walking on eggshells, managing emotions, filtering their truth, and shrinking themselves to stay in someone else's comfort zone. Courage is the choice to stop doing that. Not just once, but every day, with consistency and commitment. And the more the empath practices courage, the more natural it becomes. What once felt like betrayal now feels like freedom.
There is a particular strength in quiet decisions to not return the call, to block the number, to resist the urge to explain yourself, to stop trying to change someone who has no interest in changing. These are not dramatic acts, but they are acts of tremendous inner power, because what they really signify is that the empath is no longer seeking closure from the person who caused the wound. They are finding closure in themselves. They are learning to sit with discomfort rather than run from it. They are learning to feel their feelings rather than suppress them to keep someone else comfortable. And in doing so, they are breaking generations of conditioning. Courage also means facing the parts of themselves they neglected in order to maintain the relationship. The passions they buried, the truths they silenced, the dreams they put on hold. The empath begins to reconnect with their own essence, not who they became to survive, but who they were before the distortion. This reconnection is sacred, it is healing, and it is often the first time they felt like themselves in a very long time. The narcissist may try to re-enter their life. They may apologize, love bomb, or try to reestablish the old control. But the empath, now grounded in truth and peace, no longer reacts the same way. They may still feel the old pull, the old guilt, but they recognize it as a pattern, not a command. They choose differently. That is what the empath does each time they choose peace over approval, clarity over confusion, and truth over performance. They no longer need to win the narcissist's love because they have stopped believing that love should be painful. They no longer need to explain themselves because they have stopped seeking validation from someone who never truly listened. Their courage is not about conquering others, it is about reclaiming themselves. This reclamation is powerful because it is sustainable. It does not depend on external change. It is not reactive. It is not about proving anything. It is a quiet, steady return to self. The empath begins to live in alignment with their values. They speak from truth rather than fear. They create relationships that feel safe, reciprocal, and nourishing. They no longer feel the need to fix or rescue because they have learned that real love doesn't require sacrifice of self. And in that realization, they find strength that no narcissist can touch. Authenticity is a word often used casually, but for an empath who has endured the emotional manipulation of a narcissist, it becomes nothing short of revolutionary. To be authentic after being shaped, silenced, and spun in a web of psychological control is a brave and radical act. Narcissists operate through illusion. They create false realities, cast themselves in roles that make them appear strong, charming, and superior, while subtly diminishing others to elevate themselves. For the empath, caught in this illusion, life becomes a performance. They begin to second-guess their intuition, censor their feelings, and shapeshift to keep the narcissist pleased. Their truth becomes buried under layers of survival tactics, and somewhere along the way, they lose sight of who they really are. The empath adapts to the narcissist's reality. They adjust their tone, minimize their emotions, suppress their anger, and learn to say the right things at the right time. They do this in hopes of maintaining peace, avoiding conflict, and holding on to love. But peace is never really achieved. It's more like walking on a tightrope with no safety net. The empath's inner world becomes turbulent. Even as they present calm on the outside, they begin to feel like a stranger to themselves. And that disconnect is the breeding ground for emotional exhaustion, resentment, and quiet despair. What begins the process of transformation is a flicker of inner rebellion, often brought on by burnout, betrayal, or simply the growing realization that no amount of performing will ever make the narcissist happy. The empath starts to ask dangerous questions. What if I stopped pretending? What if I allowed myself to be fully seen without trying to manage someone else's reaction? These questions are the starting point of authenticity, and for someone who has been molded to please, they are deeply uncomfortable, but they are also liberating. As the empath begins to reconnect with their real self, they confront the fear that authenticity will cost them everything: approval, connection, even love. That fear is real, and it comes from experience. The narcissist has conditioned them to believe that love is conditional, that truth leads to conflict, and that honesty is dangerous. But the empath begins to see through the illusion. They begin to realize that if being loved means hiding who they are, it isn't love, it's control. And so slowly they begin to speak up. Not loudly at first, but clearly. They express needs, admit boundaries, and stop apologizing for their feelings. And with each honest moment, their power returns. The narcissist who once thrived on ambiguity and emotional distortion is unsettled by this change. Authenticity exposes the game. It shines light into the dark corners of manipulation. When the empath no longer plays the role assigned to them, when they stop smiling through discomfort or nodding in agreement while their spirit screams no, the narcissist loses traction. Their tactics no longer work the same way. Gaslighting becomes ineffective when the empath no longer doubts their own mind. Guilt trips fall flat when the empath no longer believes that being true to themselves is selfish. The very structure of control begins to crumble. Authenticity is not a single act. It's a way of being, and for the empath, it means giving themselves permission to stop editing their personality to fit someone else's comfort. It means crying when something hurts, laughing when something feels joyful, saying no without explaining, and saying yes without guilt. It means accepting that they are not too much or too little. They are just themselves, and that is enough. Brené Brown's work has long emphasized that authenticity requires vulnerability. It means being seen fully and without filter, even when the outcome is uncertain. For the empath, this is terrifying, but it's also the path to freedom. They begin to see that their relationships worth keeping are the ones where they can show up as they are. They stop needing to earn connection. They stop compromising their truth for temporary harmony, and they stop betraying themselves to keep someone else from feeling uncomfortable. Authenticity becomes their compass, and even though it sometimes leads to the loss of toxic relationships, it also opens the door to genuine ones, relationships that are built on respect, truth, and mutual care. There is a quiet strength in someone who no longer needs to be understood to feel valid. The empath no longer craves validation from the narcissist or anyone else who refuses to meet them in honesty. They know their worth, they know their story, they know their limits, and because they are no longer hiding, they are no longer afraid. They are living in alignment, and that alignment radiates through everything. They speak differently, move differently, breathe differently. There is no longer a performance, just presence. This transformation doesn't make the empath invincible. They still feel deeply. They still hurt, love, and hope, but they do so without compromising their identity. They have learned that authenticity is not the absence of pain. It is the refusal to abandon oneself in the midst of it. And that is what makes it stronger than any illusion a narcissist can construct. Because when you know who you are, no one can convince you otherwise. Rising strong is not about vengeance, and it's not about proving a point to those who caused harm. It's about reclaiming the pieces of yourself that were once handed away in desperation for love, approval, or peace. For the empath who has spent months or years entangled in the manipulative grip of a narcissist, rising strong is a deeply personal, transformative journey. It's not just about walking away from toxicity, it's about walking back to yourself. At the heart of it lies a truth many empaths discover only after surviving emotional chaos. Healing is the most powerful and enduring revenge there is. The empath's descent often begins subtly. It's rarely one catastrophic event that marks their fall, but rather a series of small, silent betrayals of self. They say yes when they mean no. They excuse behavior that hurts. They remain quiet to avoid conflict. Over time, their inner voice, once clear and confident, grows faint. They doubt their instincts, suppress their anger, and normalize emotional inconsistency. Their natural compassion becomes a liability, turned inward until it manifests as shame. They start believing they weren't good enough, strong enough, or lovable enough to prevent the pain. This is where the narcissist's control does its deepest damage, not in actions, but in the internal beliefs it seeds. Empath has a breaking point. Sometimes it's a moment, other times it's a slow accumulation of weariness that becomes impossible to ignore. When they finally choose to rise, it doesn't look like triumph at first. It looks like silence. It looks like solitude. It looks like crying in the middle of the day for no reason and not needing to explain it to anyone. It looks like unlearning. The empath begins to take stock of everything they lost, their sense of joy, their clarity, their self-worth. And even though that awareness is painful, it is also the first true sign of healing, because you cannot rise from something you're still denying. You have to feel it. You have to own it. You have to face the story before you can rewrite it. They begin to make different choices. They no longer seek closure from the narcissist because they realize closure is something they can give themselves. They stop rehearsing conversations in their head, trying to find the perfect words to finally be heard. They understand that being heard by someone incapable of empathy is a dead-end road. Instead, they begin to speak to themselves with kindness. They replace self-blame with compassion. They stop waiting for someone to rescue them because they are already doing the rescuing. Rising strong is a daily practice, not a one-time victory. Some days the empath will feel empowered, free, and deeply connected to their truth. Other days they will feel the old wounds reopen, moments of self-doubt, memories that sting, questions that go unanswered. But now they know how to sit with those feelings without falling into them. They've learned that healing isn't linear. It spirals. It revisits. It evolves. And every time they choose to stay with themselves through it, rather than abandoning themselves for the sake of others, they rise a little higher. They begin to rebuild a life that feels like theirs. They explore passions they once set aside. They surround themselves with people who see them clearly and love them without needing them to perform. They learn to trust their intuition again, to listen when something feels off, and to act without apology. Their energy, once consumed by emotional survival, is now channeled into creation, expression, and growth. They redefine strength, no longer measuring it by how much they can endure, but by how willing they are to walk away from what breaks them. The narcissist who once held so much power in their lives becomes a distant shadow, no longer the center of their thoughts or the driver of their behavior. The empath has stopped orbiting around someone else's needs and begun to anchor themselves in their own. They don't need revenge because they have something far better, self-ownership. They no longer fantasize about justice or recognition from the narcissist. Their healing is not performative. It's private, sacred, and profoundly real. The empath becomes someone they once thought they had to lose in order to be loved, fully themselves. They are no longer afraid to take up space, speak their truth, or walk away. They understand that true power isn't about control, it's about alignment. It's about showing up in the world with a steady heart, an open mind, and a life that reflects their worth, not their wounds. The journey of the empath from silent suffering to quiet strength is not one of revenge in the traditional sense. It's a return to wholeness. What the narcissist once mistook for weakness becomes the empath's greatest weapon: self-awareness, emotional honesty, and an unshakable commitment to truth. Each step embracing vulnerability, setting boundaries, shedding shame, choosing courage, living authentically, and rising strong builds a foundation no manipulation can ever destroy. The empath doesn't need to fight back or prove anything. Their healing, growth, and peace are louder than any retaliation. In the end,
The real victory lies not in conquering the narcissist, but in reclaiming the self they were once made to doubt. And that is a power far stronger than any control ever wielded against them.